Alright, so we're coming to the end of our discussion of web components, and we've built some web components ourselves now. We've started looking at how to use other web components. And using other web components and building web components to be used by others is really important, and really kind of that key feature of web components and why we talk about them. I think it's actually key to sort of this logo even. You see kind of the interoperability of things coming together. When we talk about being able to use components together, that's really the key feature. And a few things allow us to do that. I think primarily what allows us to use components together are these APIs. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So APIs are interfaces. They mean application programming interfaces. But just think of them as interfaces. They're interfaces for our application. Interfaces, application. So we've talked a little bit about how kind of components fit together. We looked at our interfaces at the beginning of this week. Libraries, web services, UI components. Well, web components fit in there too, and web components can interact with each other. So I have a tabs component, a time component, another component, and these can sit independently in my application. How do we interact with them? How do we use them? How does one web component talk to another? How does the outside application talk to a web component? It's all about interfaces. So remember those library interfaces? Library A has a function called library B, a function called library C. Web components have interfaces too. In fact, we've been building them all week. And web components have interfaces like any other DOM element. And these interfaces are made up of three parts: methods, attributes, and events. All right, so what are methods? So methods are functions that we call on an element. So something from the outside calls a function, say open tab if it's a tab component, or next tab. And we make these calls as function calls. We can pass in parameters, we can pass in arguments, or not. And these are calls into my component, and the component does something in response. The next piece is attributes. We've seen this a bit so far with our attribute created callback, or attribute change callback, where when things change, we can find out about that. We change our attributes on our component with that attribute. And we know we've done this from within our component as well. We've used get attribute from within our component. But I want you to start thinking about this interface from the outside of the component. Whether it's another component or an application, how are you interacting with a component? Because this is going to be the same way you're going to interact with components that you don't create. When you use Polymer next week, you're going to have a whole bunch of components in your application, and you're going to need to interact with them. And those methods and attributes and events are part of that. So while I can also programmatically set attribute, name attribute default, set it to a value 2. If I want to set, say, tabs component, I want it to default to tab 2. I can also set it to default equals to and pass that in as an attribute in the more declarative syntax just by writing HTML. And when I write HTML like this, I get an attribute, default, that's my attribute, with a value of 2. And the last piece of this API puzzle is events. So while the other pieces of the API are ways we told the component to do something from the outside, events are when the component tells the outside world that it has done something. So if the tabs component wanted to tell everyone else, hey everyone, I changed the tab, it might have a custom change tab event that just goes out. That event will fire off and maybe someone's listening to it, maybe they're not. But this is how other components and parts of our application can respond to something happening with a component. So how do we talk about events? I think this is the last piece that we haven't talked about. We've talked about methods when we set the .start and the .stop method on our blink tag. We talked about attributes when we set the interval on our slideshow and on our blink component. Well, events we haven't really talked about. So let's go back to from within the component. If I'm writing a component, how do I trigger an event? How do I tell the outside world that something has changed? Well, I can create a new event. This is a global object event. And say new event and I just put a string here, what the name of the event is. Doesn't matter what it is, but this is the event that people are going to be listening for, or components or an application is going to be listening for when something happens. I create the event, and then when I'm ready to send the event out to the world, when I'm ready to yell that something has happened, I call this, on my element, the dispatch event. And dispatch event is going to send it out there. Anybody who's listening to that event can find out about it. I'm going to pass that event object in directly. I'm not passing in a string at this point. I'm passing in the event object.
So the event field on that slide is being attached with that first line where it's change dash tab. It's being attached to the change dash tab element.
No, there are no elements here. This is change tab. It's just an arbitrary event name that I've chosen. So this is from within my event, my component. Perhaps it's within my created callback. Perhaps it's within my attribute change callback. Perhaps it's within a custom method. Anywhere from within that component, so this would be in your prototype, is where you would put it for your component. I'm just creating a name for the event. So for most of the DOM, we have events like click, change, mouse over, things like that. Here I'm just making up my own, I'm calling it change tab. Does that make sense? A little bit? Alright. Well, we'll get there once we start working on it. And then when I actually trigger the event, that's what I use dispatch event for. Now those are simple events. I can also do custom events. I can also pass in more information here. But if you look at this object, so new custom event is the object I use, the constructor I use to create this new custom event. It's not actually that different from the simple events. The first parameter is still an arbitrary string for the name of the event. I've chosen change tab again. I just have a second parameter, second argument, that passes in an object and that I can pass more information in there so that whoever is consuming my event can get some information about what happened. So instead of just hearing on change event, they might want to know, well, what tab changed? Or what was the previous tab? So in this case, any of that information, any of the sort of custom details I want to give to the world, I put that under a details property. So I have a details key and then a value is just the object of the data I want in. Again, this can be anything. This is what I want to give to the rest of the world so that they know my component changed. And then the second key here is bubbles. And I don't know if how much time you spent with events in HTML, but events usually bubble. You can stop an event from bubbling completely. So if I have an event that triggers at one point and I could be listening to the document for that same event and it would bubble up to my document. So for example, if I listen to a click on the document, even if I click on something within the document, it's going to eventually get to document. And there's a whole event model for that, all HTML event, how events work in HTML. I'm not going to get into that now, but whether it bubbles or not is sometimes a helpful thing to have control over, and we do indeed have control over that here. So you can actually trigger any sort of event you'd like, and pass in any information you want. So this is a really powerful piece of that API. And then from the outside world, so this was all within your component. Now we're going to go with outside the component. So this is going to be your application, your website, your another component on the page. You can add an event listener to listen to that. And so we've done this before. We go element.addEventListener. We pass in the name of the event, but instead of it being click or change or something else, we do the name of the event that we know we're supposed to be listening for, that someone else defined here. So we say add event listener for change tab, and then we pass in our callback function to do something. And the parameter we get in the callback function is that event object. So we can get information about that event. Yes?
Do they call it a callback function because it's a function that kind of gets run when something else runs, and so when another thing runs, it's like, okay, I got to call back and see what I need to run. Like, why do they call it callback?
They call it a callback. I'm not sure the source of the term, but we refer to callback functions when something else is done. So we pass in a function basically at the top of a of a function here. So like add event listener, we're going to pass in this function. I call it a callback because when the event happens, it's going to get called. So something else is happening, and then when something else occurs, it's going to say, oh hey, I got to call this function that they gave me.
Call them back to the listener to run the function.
Yeah, it's one way we handle sort of kind of asynchronous patterns.
I just heard that phrase used.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. We do callback functions quite a bit in JavaScript. We have other methods of handling asynchronous operations as well. Promises, generators. Those are a little more complicated, so we'll stick with callback functions for now. And yeah, the E here again, I was talking with someone about this earlier today. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's just going to be that whatever the first parameter passed into this function is, will be the event object. So you can call it event, you can call it E, those are common names. You want to call it something so that when someone else looks at it, they're like, oh, that's the event object. And then it's just like any other event. You get current target, you get target, you get all sorts of information there. And you can also access the details object here if you want to access the special information that you got passed from a custom event. So, what is the previous tab, what is the new tab? All right, so that's kind of the technical piece of how do we write APIs for our custom elements. And this afternoon we'll spend some time adding features to our elements. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about writing good APIs. I think there are three pieces of good APIs three characteristics that good APIs share. The first is naming, how we name things. Sometimes I'll say, you can arbitrarily name something. And that just means like it doesn't have a technical requirement that you name it a certain way, but I don't really mean you should pick an arbitrary name. You should pick a name that's meaningful. I'm going to bring out, this is the second time I've brought up this quote this week. There are only two hard things in computer science, caching, validation, and naming things. Naming is very important. When someone looks at your event, say, change tab. Well, in the context of tabs, that might make sense. But if I just called it change, that might not make sense. Or if I just said new tab or something that maybe made sense to me, but not to someone who's using my component, that's not going to be very helpful. And they're going to struggle with it for a long time until they realize, oh, that's actually when that's happening. And that goes for functions too, for methods. If I have my blink tag and I want to make it stop blinking, stop I think makes sense because it's blink tag stop. But there might be things that are harder to figure out names for, and I think it's worth taking some time to think about that and figure out really, what should it be named. That's sort of the documentation you get for free. Like good names are the documentation pieces that you don't have to write. The next is extensibility. We've talked a little bit about extensibility. We've talked about how HTML, how custom elements give us extensibility for HTML. But your components need to be extensible too. If you have a bad API for your component, people won't want to use them. You won't be able to really share them. No one will want to pick them up. And maybe you don't care about that, but you're not going to want to use them either. You're not going to want to use them in your application. Your team's not going to want to use them. You, 3 weeks from now, will not want to use it. I always say that, like, when someone says, oh, I don't need to design, this piece of software for anyone else because I'm just going to be the only one working on it. I'm like, well, you 3 months from now is almost like a new person because you probably won't remember what you wrote. You probably won't remember how you wrote it. And if you ever looked at code that you wrote a year ago, you might look at that and be like, that's absolutely terrible. All right, abstractions are leaky. This is kind of a saying in computer science and engineering, software engineering, that as we start to create abstractions, as we start to kind of expose certain parts of things and make them easier, generalize things, they're never going to be perfect. Otherwise you wouldn't be making an abstraction. Right, you're always going to lose things in that process. You're going to have some noise. So make sure you're abstracting the right things. Make sure that the extensibility points that you make available are helpful. If I made a blink tag that allowed me start and stop only, but not change the speed, well, then there wouldn't be a way for anyone to use that to change the speed. Or if I just didn't extend one certain piece, then I'm going to miss out on something. And I might think, well, I had a whole bunch of other methods, but if they weren't helpful, then no one's going to be able to extend your component. Think about other ways that people are going to want to use your component. And the last piece to good APIs are documentation. And this is not a technical piece, so I wanted to demo some of the good documentation that's out there. Documentation is what we write so that others can use our components, our APIs. GitHub has some really good documentation, not in terms of an API, but in terms of how to use their application. I think having some sort of FAQ like this is really helpful, and for a small component, you wouldn't be as extensive, but you might have a small FAQ that might be helpful for your component. Say, how do I change the color of this, or how do I change the style, or how do I, say, change the interval on a slideshow. Twitter has a pretty extensive set of APIs for their services. And so you can go into their documentation. So if we go to, like, for example, their REST APIs, let's see. You notice on the side here, so these are RESTful web APIs for applications to use. If I want to say get status as user timeline, I can get some information in a very organized fashion about how this works. So it starts with like a description, returns a collection of the most recent tweets posted by the user indicated by their screen name or the user ID parameters. Has some more points here, gives me some external resources I can turn to. Then it gives me the URL, right? And then it cuts to the chase and it's like, this is the technical information you need. So let's see what you need. Well, you need a URL. You're not going to be able to get to my API if I don't give you a URL. You're going to need some information about the data, response formats, JSON. They're all going to be in JavaScript object notation, not XML or something else. Does it require authentication? Yes. So I need some sort of way to authenticate. Is it rate limited? Yes. What is that rate limit? Request per 15-minute window, 180. Request per 15-minute window. If you have an app off, it's 300. And it has the parameters that I need. Again, because this is a web service, right? These are parameters I'm going to pass in to my request. But I think there's an analog here in how we build our components. Things like methods, properties, attributes. What do they all mean? We have the name of it. We say whether it's optional or not. We describe it, and then we have an example value. We have this for everything. We have an example request, an example code. So what would the example request look like? What does the example result look like? And I think all that for one part of the API, I think is pretty helpful. We've been building up our style guide throughout this week, and it's fine that we've been sort of just throwing our components in there. I've tried to suggest that you put the code example in there as well. And sometimes we have, sometimes we haven't. But if we have time today, or over the weekend, or next week, or if you're working on something like this for an actual company or organization or application, take some time to do this sort of non-technical stuff and put together the documentation. It's a really valuable skill to be able to write technical documentation well. Because otherwise, someone's just looking at code, and that's kind of useless. So you can be very thorough in how you write your documentation. I think that's very helpful. Have a code example. Have information about every parameter, about every attribute, every method, every event, and document that out. Let's see. Ruby has some pretty good, Rails, has some pretty good documentation. Again, code examples, I think that's very important. Kind of the long form text is helpful, and links are helpful, but in terms of, for code, I think there's nothing to replace actual code examples. Sometimes we're able to see the examples, we can copy and paste them, try them out. Always make sure they work. There's nothing worse than documentation that has a code example that doesn't work. You don't know if it's you or them.
Android.com comes to mind. My code does not work.
This is the Google Maps JavaScript API, And we're getting a little closer to our elements, right? But again, a lot of code examples, some very specific code and kind of sample apps, right? Like this isn't just how to use the component, this is how to use the component to do something. And I think that's helpful. These are like mini recipes that you can take and try out and modify and see how they work. Yeah.
Are you using API interchangeably with component right now?
I'm using API interchangeably with interface. So an API is an application programming interface. So it's an interface for an application. So I mean, yeah, interface is a more generic term. But yeah, API is.
But you're saying you could use this, you said you could use this component just now.
Yes, or you use the component always by its interface. The method that you use your component is by your interface.
Yeah, actually, that threw me off when you first started talking about it too, because, I mean, the traditional way we think about APIs is in a Google Maps sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we interface with that? So you're saying here we're writing components, and then we have to tell people how to interface with those components through that process of interface, right?
Yes. Yeah, API here is not like, we've been writing our API all this week.
Yeah.
We just haven't called it that.
Yeah,
But our API, it's those methods, it's those events, it's those properties, it's those attributes. Yeah, those aren't, this is not some new technology piece, other than the events, which we haven't really done. I'm using that term in the generic sense. This is how we interface with it. That was a good question. We've already looked at the Bootstrap documentation. I just want to look at it again. We know we're using that as sort of a demo, but you know, again here, these are UI components. We're getting closer and closer to our own components. You know, we have an example of it, a visual example of what it looks like when you use it right. We have what the code exactly corresponds to what that example is. It's also kind of frustrating if the code does not correspond to the example. So just try to keep that in mind. You know, I like that they're in isolation. I like that, you know, we're not seeing this too much. There's not too much stuff in the background. We can see exactly that this component is a label component, and then I immediately see the labels, right? Or the variations of those labels. And we have these little callouts that are helpful. And again, you know, as we're learning components, that's fine. Like we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but you know, on an actual project, I think it's important to spend a lot of time on this. And I've been on a lot of projects where that's not the case, and that can be very difficult. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that, you know, documentation, you have to keep it up to date, too. Keeping your documentation very close to your code, I think, is important. You know, whether that's putting them in the same directories, having some sort of link where your documentation is generated by your code. I mean, there are a whole bunch of possibilities on keeping that as living as possible. Sometimes old documentation is worse than new documentation, so keeping it up to date, having a system for doing that, whether it be an automatic system or a manual workflow, is important. All right, and I did want to pull up the Polymer catalog components that we looked at a little bit yesterday. You know, if I pull up say the Google Web components that we looked at a little bit, and I pull up that Google Map example, you know, these are actually web components. So we've gone from, you know, web APIs and coding APIs and UI elements in Bootstrap to now we're actually looking at web component documentation. So, you know, these should be pretty close to what we're doing. A couple things that this does really nicely is we have a version at the top. Components change, they get updated. We talked about the nice feature of the modularity of components is that they're versionable. We can have different versions of them. Again, we have examples. We have our properties here. These are our properties, and that can be changed on our elements along with the types. So Boolean, string, what the defaults are. We did interval for Blink and slideshow, and you probably set a default if the user didn't input it, right? You probably set 500 milliseconds or 1,000 milliseconds or something as a default. It's good to let them know what that default is. You know, we have our methods here. There are only a couple methods, clear and resize on the map. But again, these are your prototype.foo equals function methods when you create your element. And then we have our events. these are those custom events that I was talking about. Google Map click, Google Map drag, drag in, drag start, map ready, map right click. And this is what I think we should sort of strive for in terms of how we build out the documentation for components. Having a place where we can see all our components together and how to use them, I think is very important. So what needs to be documented for components? I think we need a description. We need all our methods. We need our attributes. So methods being those functions, like start and stop. Attributes, those something equals in HTML, so our interval on our slideshow, for example. Our events, any custom events that we're using. How it's supposed to be used. And then examples. What the actual code is. Maybe examples of different combinations of attributes. What that looks like. All right, so the exercises, sort of takeaway for this is to, one, look at your existing components and see where their interface needs to be kind of fleshed out a little bit more. Where could you have put an event in that you didn't? Maybe on your slider component, you could say, hey, slide changed, and trigger that event. A good example where that would be useful is if you had like another component that needed to do something that wanted to like be in sync with that slider, it would need to know when something changed. Add attributes if you haven't added them. If you've noticed any values that are hard-coded, start thinking about that extensibility. How can you start to expect the unexpected in terms of how your components will be used? And then add that to your style guide as well as your documentation along with it. So description, usage examples, etc. And that will allow us to create a more solid collection of components.